In this series of videos, we're going to be talking about the external environment. So we're going to talk about how you can view the environment, and that's going to lead us to be able to analyze the environment. We're going to talk about the environment in two segments, the general environment and the competitive environment, and talk about the differences between them. And we're going to dive in depth into the Porter's five forces concept because I think his techniques for industry analysis form a very solid foundation for strategic thought. I ask you to read the short article by Andy Grove, and what it really is the introduction to his book, Only the Paranoid Survive. Andy Grove is no longer a household name, but he once was. He was the man that basically transformed Intel into the great chip giant that it became during the PC era. What most people don't know is that transition into the PC chip business was not necessarily a voluntary one. It was forced upon them by changes in the semiconductor industry that were led by the Japanese and their desire to have a semiconductor industry and their worldwide dumping of products that caused that to go from a profitable industry to an unprofitable industry. And Andy says a lot of great things that I think are a great motivator for what we're talking about here. He says he worries about competitors, but that he worried more about changes in the bigger picture. That would be the general environment that in his lexicons says changes the very fundamentals of a business, something he calls a strategic inflection point. And Andy in this short article says, I worry about a lot of things, but nothing more so than whether a strategic inflection point is upon me. And he makes the pithy point that it is, when it comes to strategic inflection points, it's more blessed to be on the giving end than on the receiving end of those sorts of changes. But he's my poster boy for saying that you've got to pay attention to what goes on around you. So if you go back to my favorite football analogy, the opposing team is the competitive environment, but the atmospheric conditions, the stadium, and those sorts of things, that's the general environment. They don't necessarily directly affect the play, but then again, they bring in a lot of factors that if you don't recognize, can change the state of play. When you're talking about the external environment, and I'm not a huge believer in the simplistic SWOT analysis that perhaps many of you have heard about and even have used, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, but it is useful to say that the external environment is typically a source of opportunities and threats, where the internal environment is what you do about them. So in the external environment, the general environment are the factors surrounding, and then you see the Porter's five forces in the center of this diagram. Let's talk about the general environment and what's involved. Now, what I've tried to do on this slide is go from slowest acting to fastest acting with principles around global, and I'll explain that in a bit. Demographic changes tend to occur slowly. You can see them coming, and that means, in theory, you have time to adjust. For example, we've been talking for decades, literally, that the United States was becoming an increasingly Hispanic and Asian descent country. And the day is about upon us when a Caucasian person will no longer be the majority ethnic race in the United States. In fact, there won't be a majority. We'll all be minorities, meaning less than 50%. So that's well known and tends to be well reacted on. Sociocultural, again, tends to be well seen. These are shifts in the way we do business. Some major sociocultural shifts would be the rise of women in the workforce, which, for example, spawned the casual dining industry, because as a kid, I can tell you, you didn't go out to eat very much because families didn't have the disposable income. With mama back at work, you come home and she says, I'm not interested in cooking. And so you see the line of TGI Fridays and all the rest that fit into that space. But the cultural shifts can occur a little bit faster and can be somewhat unpredictable, and you see that we talk a lot about the millennial generation today and how their tastes are different. An example of that is kids today are not in love as much with the automobile in the United States as they were in my generation. Everybody went out and got their driver's license as soon as they could when I was a kid. That's not true today. And the auto manufacturers are seeing a declining purchase of cars by younger buyers. And that is problematic for them, something that they're going to have to address. Economic shifts can be very rapid and very dramatic, but often not long lasting. And what I mean by that is Toyota and Honda a couple of years ago were really getting pinched by the fact that the yen was very strong against the dollar and some other currencies. And when they were manufacturing so many of their cars in Japan, that left them at a disadvantage. Of course, those currency rates have shifted a little bit. Economies boom, economies bust, and it makes a difference. They often don't act in isolation, though, and let me illustrate it with this out of one of my favorite industries, and that would be the aviation industry. In the economic downturn of '08, a lot of the lower wealthy were affected by that. And the business jet manufacturers have seen that the sale of their more numerous, more popular, smaller models has been affected dramatically. They're still really in recession. Some of that was also a sociocultural, that President Obama has used use of a business jet as indication that you're a fat cat taking too much. That's really hurt the industry. What has not been affected, however, are the very high-end business jets, the super expensive ones. Why? Because the super wealthy have not really been affected by the economic downturn, and they don't care if they get bashed as much. In many cases, these are not corporate jets, these are personal jets, and very large, capable personal jets. And so the sales of those airplanes have gone on apace. Technological change is obvious, so much that what happens in the internet, we know many industries that are still in the process of being disrupted by technological change. So I think that one's pretty self-evident. Political legal, this can be sudden and dramatic. Example, the Obama administration has, through the EPA, has recently written guidelines on utility power plant emissions. Sounds benign enough. Not if you're the coal industry, because, and these things are not yet set in stone, they're still being negotiated, but if they go in as they were first drafted, it will basically be impossible from an environmental standpoint to ever build another coal-fired electric generating plant. What's that going to do to the demand for coal? Obvious, because most coal is used in power plants. And so there's a change in the political legal environment that fast that can have dramatic impact on an industry, albeit not all at once. So now and global. I put global in parentheses because global was something that hit the charts, I don't know, probably about 20 years ago, because the world was becoming a more global place, and that's true. But now it's kind of passe. We think global from the get-go, so I don't really think, personally, global trends are as much, because every global trend is represented in one of those other factors. So now, strategic inflection points. What role do these play? Well, that's something that we're going to chew on a little bit more in some activities. But here's an interesting question, something again we'll chew on in our activities. To what extent can firms influence these elements in the general environment? Can they? Do they? What effect? We're going to put a bow tie on this discussion in just a minute and talk about forecast. Join me in the next video.